You are live.
This is 29. Okay, we're live. This is the Senate Education Committee on January 29th, 2024. And today we're going to spend the first thing on our agenda is to listen to Oliver Olson, who works with the Vermont Independent School Association, to give us one of the things we're going to have to figure out as we go through the process of reviewing the governor's proposal, the secretary's proposal. It's going to come our way is how the independent schools fit into this overall framework of the Vermont independent schools, where they serve a comparatively small number of children as it relates to the whole, play a critical role in the system. And so we need to understand both the history and where they are now, how it works, and we'll show this. I suspect this will be the first of several times that we're having people in to talk about this topic. But we want to. I asked Oliver to start us with stepping way back and giving us the history of how the independent school system emerged in Vermont, and then taking us through as far as we're going to go today, where we are now. So that you can add to that in any way you want to. We'll start by actually going around and introducing ourselves. We'll start.
Hey, good to see you again. Nader Hashim, Windham County.
Dave Weeks, Rutland County.
Seth Baumgart's Bennington District.
Terry Williams, Rutland District.
Steve Heffernan, Addison County District.
So the reason I say district for people is because I've got a few towns outside of Bennington County, and it could be too. So, and we have with us.
Excellent. So for the record, Oliver Olson, I'm here on behalf of the Vermont Independent Schools Association. And as the chair indicated, he had asked me to come in and provide a little bit of history on how the independent school system in Vermont developed. So I put together a variety of slides, and I want this to be sort of conversational. So feel free to interrupt me as we go. And as Seth alluded to, I'm going to start from the very, very beginning. And I'm trying to, you're going to find that a lot of what I'm talking about doesn't always talk about independent schools, because what I'm trying to, you'll see as I go through this presentation, what I'm trying to do is put this in the context of how the overall education system in Vermont developed, and particularly the governance structures, and essentially to help you understand, like, as you're looking at some pretty fundamental changes in our governance structures with school districts, et cetera, and you're looking at these maps and you're like, supervisory union, supervisory district, school district, and you're looking at map and you're trying to understand, like, how does this, how do we get to this place? Understanding some of the sort of the historical roots will help you, I think, in your journey as you're trying to solve, this bigger challenge, but also then thinking about how the independent schools fit into the equation. So again, feel free to interrupt at any point and ask questions as we go along. And then I don't have too many slides. I think it's like 13 or something. So we'll have plenty of time as we get to the end to answer questions, just talk generally about kind of the state of independent schools in Vermont's landscape today. So first of all, just an overview on VISA, which is founded in 1965 as the Vermont Independent Schools Association. And you'll see, looking back in history, we had originally the notion of academies. The vernacular has evolved over the years. For many decades, people thought of private schools. And then, really starting in the 1960s, that vernacular, as many things from that era, evolved into the current term of art, as reflected in state statutes and rules, is independent schools. So it was founded by Linden Institute, St. Johnsbury Academy, and Vermont Academy.
Sorry.
No worries, thanks. So VISA is governed by a 9-member executive committee, roughly 42 member schools, which include a variety of different schools, ranging from what are colloquially known as the 4 historic academies, and we'll talk more about those. General education schools, we have a number of specialized schools, notably the ski academies. And then we also have what are known as therapeutic or special education schools. That's an important part of our landscape. And then I would also create a separate sort of category. Again, it's not in formal rule at all, but we have the notion of schools that are sort of alternatives schools. So fundamental thing about the association, all of its member schools are nonprofit organizations. They're governed by a student-centered philosophy, and sort of key part of the DNA of these schools is that they all exist to ensure that there's a diversity of learning environments and educational opportunities that meet the unique needs of each student. All of our schools uphold and fully support without qualification state, federal anti-discrimination laws and regulations, and are committed to self-evaluation and continuous improvement, right? So like all organizations, schools, public, independent, otherwise, nobody's perfect, and it's this is it's all about being on a journey to self-improvement, and that's sort of the cornerstone of what our independent schools are.
Just a quick one.
Yep.
Thanks, sir. So general education schools, that category?
Yep.
Long Trail? Is that an example?
Exactly, yes, yeah. And we'll talk a little, that's a great example, and I know you have them in later this week, and they can sort of elaborate on that, but yeah, exactly. And then you start getting into, I think it's good to think about schools on a spectrum, right? That, just like people, are on a spectrum, and, there are schools that, technically are general education schools, but are at different points in that spectrum and serve different kids with different needs. So we have some schools, and, I can point to some examples where, they're really, their mission is really to serve, kids who, who really, quite frankly, struggle in other environments. And we kind of call those like sort of alternative schools. So up on the screen, you'll see, we have a map. What I did is with this map, sort of plotted out two things. One are all of our member schools. So the green circles represent independent schools operating at high school levels only. The triangles are elementary schools, and then I think there's one diamond on here, which is a K through 12 school. And then the other, and then the sort of red dot represents our therapeutic school members. And again, we'll talk more about those later on. Also in this overlay, you can see there's obviously the map of Vermont, and superimposed upon that are the so-called non-operating districts. So these are all school districts that do not operate some or all grades, operate public schools. So they tuition some or all grades. It's hard to kind of call out the shading on here, but the very bright green ones, they operate no public school whatsoever. So they tuition all of their students K through 12. There's some red ones, particularly up in the Kingdom. Those are the Boers. So those are also non-operating, but there's, very, very few human beings there. And then the sort of next shading down are, so you can see over like Paulet and Rupert, Wells, et cetera. They operate public schools through grade 6, and then they tuition 7 through 12. And then probably the greatest number are the kind of the darker shade of gray, and those are the districts that only tuition high school grades. And we're going to return to this map as we go through the history, but I just want to give you a sense of who we are as an association and who our members are. Just yes.
So there is some schools there's quite a few schools that are not aligned with you as well.
Correct. Yes.
Kind of like Red Cedar in Bristol. They don't.
So we do. Oh, that's a great point. So our members under the terms of the association's bylaws we only have approved independent schools. So there's a class of schools known as recognized schools that are subject to very minimal state regulation. A distinguishing characteristic, though, is that they are ineligible for any form of public tuition. So the kids who are attending there are through basically private pay only. But that is a great question. Yes.
So then every school you have here in your association is supported by public?
That's another great question. So there are actually 5 that are not, and we're going to get to this. There was a recent change in statutes and in rules that we now have. We used to just have one category of approved independent schools, and they were all by default eligible for public tuition. We now have 2 categories. There are those who are approved and eligible for public tuition, and those who are approved but ineligible for public tuition. So a great example, Senator Heffernan, in your district is this Triangle, the Bridge School in Middlebury.
Mm-hmm.
They are ineligible for public tuition, and not surprising, they've made that, and that's a choice that they've made. Under the new rules, you can basically pick a path. Do you want to be eligible or ineligible? And there are additional requirements to be eligible for public tuition. You'll notice you have the distinction, Senator Heffernan, having almost not quite all, but nearly all of the towns in your Senate district are operating public schools. And you see this Bridge School as an example, it's right in the middle of it in Middlebury, but they really just serve private pay students. They don't, historically, they really haven't had publicly tuition students because they're surrounded by public schools. But great question. Okay, so now we're going to go back, way back in time. And so we go back to the founding of Vermont. And again, I'm presenting you this history here of kind of the early days to put all this into perspective. And there was one of the first laws in the books, 1782, permitted towns to create one or more school districts within each town. And then it was Act 23 in 1827 that actually required towns to establish school districts. And what was interesting is, there was this notion of creating as many school districts as you want within a town. And if you think about how, modes of transport back in the day, it was either, it was a horse and carriage, or, if you were lucky, or, you were hoofing it to school. So by, just sort of virtue of the topography, et cetera, towns, essentially, roughly 40 square miles in most towns, created many school districts with many sort of traditional, one-room schoolhouses that were accessible on foot to those students. So what we saw is that the governance of our public education system sort of became highly fragmented, such that by 1860 we had 2,680 school districts across the state.
We have made progress.
we have made progress. So then came along what's known as the Vicious Act of 1892, and this was really the first effort at sort of governance consolidation in our education system. And the legislature essentially forced towns to consolidate to one district per town. With a few exceptions, there was an earlier provision in law that allowed towns to create what were known as incorporated districts. So you'll see, and I always wondered about this for many years, you'll see in various charts and graphs, you'll see references to some school districts in Vermont that end with the initials ID. Those school districts literally can trace their lineage back to the 19th century, and they were sort of exempt from this law that was passed in 1892. Everybody else had to consolidate down to one district per town. So one thing, may not be obvious to a lot of people, but when we talk about sort of public education, and you're going to see that the concept of public education in Vermont was not, it was an evolution. It was not a revolution. And what people thought of as education in the early days was really about elementary education, right? It was your classic one-room schoolhouse, and you think about one teacher with a room full of kids. There's a limit to what that, the education that teacher can provide. So, that's, think of the classic 3 R's, right? That was really the focus. And outside the urban areas, right? We just didn't have the scale to support any kind of sort of secondary education infrastructure. So you'll hear this term, common schools. Those were sort of the original sort of elementary schools. Again, think one-room schoolhouse. But education was not again, the concept of public education sort of evolved, and education was not free from the onset. So it wasn't until Act 61 in 1864 that the cost of education was actually made free to students. And then it wasn't until 1894 that the textbooks were actually made available at no charge to the students. Up until that point, there were various taxing mechanisms, but they only provided certain sort of, base funding. And then unless the voters chose otherwise, the families were actually expected to make a financial contribution towards the students' education. So that's kind of how the common schools and elementary school education evolved. Very early on, there was a recognition that we needed a secondary education system, and goes right back to our Constitution. There's reference to the concept of a county grammar school, and the original sort of framers of our Constitution intended there to be essentially one per county. And they were originally endowed through what were known as glebe lands or lease lands. And what was interesting is that there were, at the time that Vermont was founded as a state, and for those of you who study the history of Vermont, you'll know that Vermont was not a colony. It was sort of shared between competing claims of New Hampshire and New York, and there were overlapping land charters that were granted, etc. So when Vermont came into its own existence, a lot of the land had already been claimed, but there were parcels that had not been claimed, and you can imagine where a lot of those parcels were. Right, they were up in the hills, up in the woods, uninhabitable. Nobody wanted to live there, or up near the Canadian border. Because everybody was afraid of an invasion from Canada, so people didn't want to settle up there. And there were some counties, like Chittenden County and Bennington County, actually had no lease lands at all. So there was actually no mechanism to fund one of these grammar schools. The other issue is that the value of the lease income eroded over time through the magic of inflation. And then just to compound that further, there were towns that had there were these county grammar schools were established, but again, we're back in the day of the horse and buggy, and transportation wasn't always convenient from one part of the county to the next. So different parties were starting to organize, essentially competing county grammar schools, and then they were trying to claim part of the rents. And the legislature stepped in at various points in time and started to sort of bifurcate out these lands. So before you know it, we had some of these schools, and there was really no consistent mechanism to fund them, limited, public resources, and then families were expected to make up the difference. So now we sort of turn into the, as we get into the 1800s, the county grammar school concept, was struggling, and we started to see the emergence of what then were known as academies. And this was not unique to Vermont. This is really a New England phenomenon where, as we evolved as a people and started to, develop industry and commerce, and the hinterlands were being populated with, better educated people, there was greater demand. And we started to see this academy movement where these schools were being privately established and privately endowed to get off the ground. So as an example here, Burton Seminary was established in 1829 through the bequest of one Joseph Burr, with the instructions that his bequest was to be applied in educating in the village of Manchester poor and pious youth. Right. So we had these schools that were developing as academies well before the concept of public high school education really started to come into its own. And again, a lot of these academies this next slide here, I pulled out of a report that was issued by a federal agency back in 1900, and it'll give you a sense of, I highlighted here what we now think of as the 4 historic academies. There was actually, and still is to this day, a 5th one that's operating, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But you'll see that there's a number of these other academies that existed as of 1890. And a lot of them were out in the kind of rural areas of the state. Because as we started getting towards the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, we started seeing the concept of public education at the secondary level develop and mature in our more urban areas. So early 1900s, you start to see, Burlington has a high school, Springfield has a high school, but going back to this concept of 1 district per town, there wasn't a governance mechanism in place that provided the scale necessary to make that happen. So it really fell on the shoulders of individual citizens and private entities to make that happen. Senator Williams.
BFAs, Bells for Academy,
Yeah.
including that?
So they came a little bit after this, and that has an interesting history as well. So a similar thing that was established through private benefactor, Mr. Bellows. And that had a slightly different history than many of these other older academies, in that when that was established through his will and trust, there was a stipulation that the board of trustees be appointed by the select board in town, which was a unique feature that none of these other institutions have that are still existing. A great question. And BFA was an independent school and an academy, although it was quite a bit different because by virtue that all of its trustees were appointed by the board of the select board or the older board. They actually converted into a public school in the early 2000s. So anyway, so just fun little interesting historical artifact. So you go through and you look at some of these schools. So Peachum Academy is an interesting one. This is actually one of the original county grammar schools. It was founded in, I think, 1795, and then sort of evolved into an academy and existed until the late 60s, early 70s. And I'm going to talk about that because there was a kind of a watershed moment in the sort of mid 20th century that saw quite a bit of change in Vermont's landscape. So fast forward into the 20th century. So as you all know, we saw some pretty big change, particularly sort of after the Second World War. So one thing that's really important to note is 1948, only 46% of kids in Vermont graduated from high school. And a lot of that was by virtue of the fact that we really didn't have a well-developed secondary public education system outside of the areas that were served by these historic academies. Still had a lot of one-room schoolhouses, 1 school district per town. So that 1 school district per town really limited the scale. There was also another, challenge at the time was there was a cap on tuition. So school districts that did not operate their own schools, they were obligated to pay tuition to a receiving school, whether it was an independent school or a public school. But there was a cap that was established annually, and in some cases was not updated for several years on what those districts could pay. So fun fact, we did not actually have a universal entitlement to free public education until 1965. Until 1965, a lot of kids out in the rural areas, if they wanted to go to high school because there were these sort of restrictions on tuition payments, the family actually had to pay the difference or forego a high school education. So this created a lot of financial challenges on all schools, both the public schools receiving tuition students, but certainly the independent schools that were serving these areas. The few other things, sort of the whole back to land movement, we saw, rapid increase in just a few decades. And I put the population stats here from the Census Bureau, big increase in the number of people moving into Vermont. It's funny to think about that as a challenge. When we're talking about declining student enrollment over the last couple of decades, we had the opposite problem in mid-century. So another sort of feature of sort of the earlier education system in Vermont was we had, the Catholic Church operated a large number of schools across the state in both urban and rural areas. And for a variety of societal reasons, there was rapid contraction of the number of those parochial schools. So in a 2-year span, there were literally 16 parochial schools that closed. And it basically, created this influx of 2,000 students in a system with a lot of one-room schoolhouses without a lot of public high school infrastructure. There was actually, I found in the state archives, there was actually a report that was commissioned by the legislature in 1969 to look at what they termed as a crisis. They had all these kids that basically now were sort of dumped at the doorstep, and they didn't know what to do with them. So a lot of challenges kind of at the midpoint of the century. So that sort of started to bring into focus some conversations here. So Act 66 of 1945 and Act 202 of 1953 were really the first mechanisms to create what became known as union school districts, where 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 town school districts could come together. And the idea was, hey, if we come together, we can create some scale, and now we can build a regional school that's going to serve all of our kids. I want to say the first example of that was the Champlain Valley Union High School. But as we've seen with successive efforts, whether it's Act 153 or Act 46, and what you guys all are about to deal with now, there's not a lot of appetite for that. By 1962, only 6 union districts had been established. So, meanwhile, we're seeing our population grow. The facilities are challenged. Our independent schools are struggling under, kind of financial constraints of, limits on tuition. So we have a new governor, Governor Hoff, elected, watershed moment. In the 1960s, for all sorts of reasons I'm sure you're well aware of. And one of the first things he did when he was inaugurated was he established a task force. And I actually put in your materials, I sent over in your folder, is a copy of the report that this task force wrote in October of '63. So this is about 6 weeks before JFK was assassinated, just to put this in perspective. And this report, this task force, they recommended that we consolidate what were over 250 school districts into 12 regional school districts, that we substantially increase the state's contribution to state funding from what was then 21% to 40%. And then we provide substantial state capital construction aid to assist with the sort of the construction of new schools, both at the elementary level, but also kind of this concept of these regional public high schools. Over on the right, you'll see, I just thought there's some fun little facts here on kind of the state. This came out of, was one of the artifacts out of that work of the task force. But as you can see, the smallest high school in Vermont is in Middletown Springs. It's hard to think that Middletown Springs had a high school, but they did. Grades 7 through 12, 38 students. So, it just gives you a sense of kind of the challenges of scale operating within single town districts. So, 1964, that proposal was brought forth to the legislature, and for those of you counting, this was about a year before the U.S. Supreme Court mandated the consolidation of the Vermont House. So at that time, there were 254 members of the House. 251.
Unless Gore's got it.
I think there was 250. Well,
Gore's got it.
but just so so if you think about this, right, 1964, you've got 250 something House members, one for each town. So Burlington had one, Middletown Springs had one. So when you start talking about consolidating school districts, conversation is very different with that composition in the legislature versus what we have today. So that was promptly rejected, but many of the concepts, the ideas, there was recognition that, hey, we don't want to get rid of all of our school districts. We like that, but we still have a problem, and we need to find a path forward. So there ultimately were a number of things that happened between the sort of mid to late 60s and into the early 70s. So one thing is the State Board of Ed established what were then known as minimum standards, and it really focused on kind of the inputs of what a school should look like. So it mandated things like what kind of equipment the science lab needed to have, what the library needed to look like, things of that nature. It's very prescriptive. It was a very prescriptive formula about what a high school should look like. And then they did ultimately move forward with establishing state capital construction aid. It wasn't 50%; it was 30%, but it was only made available to public school districts. So independent schools, academies, they're not part of the mix at all. And then at the same time, there was a comprehensive sort of revamping of the overall education finance formula, was then known as the Miller formula, which then over the successive decades, pretty much every 10 years, there was a new formula that came out. But sort of the original one was the Miller formula in 1969. So what we saw was we saw a number of both public schools, but also independent schools, historic academies that closed during this time period. So I mentioned Peacham Academy was really the first, kind of the first academy in Vermont in 1795. They were forced to close their doors because they just didn't survive in this new environment that had been created. So we started to see, literally buildings being torn down and new buildings being built. And we have, many of these, Senator Weeks, I'm sure, can appreciate, Wallingford, the old Wallingford High School is still there. It was, their Mill River Union High School really took its place. So as you're thinking about, the task before you now, there were a lot of these schools built, and they were all built about the same time. And there's a reason why we have all this deferred maintenance, and they're all sort of coming due at the same time because they were all built around the same time. So, anyway, a lot of independence.
That photo back there, that was the old Leland Gray?
This is Leland Gray was then known as Leland Gray Seminary. And that is an example. That was an academy that was closed, and in its place there was a Union High School that was constructed in its place. So this is what the original one. There were actually multiple. It was a multi-building campus. This is what one of the buildings was. So 1960s are really, another sort of interesting little tidbit, as I alluded to before. So 1965, in the 1960s, there was this challenging period where the tuition being, the allowable tuition did not match what the actual cost was. So families were either having to make up the difference, or schools were having to sort of, live with, unrealistic resources, which led to, the collapse of some of these schools. So, this is an extract of an article I put on here from the Burlington Free Press in 1965. And it's really stunning to think that, we really didn't have a universal entitlement to a free public high school education until 1965. So we're into the 70s and 80s, and we, during that time period, We also, with this, rapid increase in population that had occurred in the preceding decades, we also saw sort of changing attitudes around how we were serving kids with special education needs, kids who, needed some sort of an alternative environment. So we, as you look at schools, independent schools in Vermont, there were a number of schools that began in the 1970s and 80s, and some of them are gen ed schools today. Some of them are what we would term alternative schools. Some are, what we now know as therapeutic schools that were really developed to serve the needs of these kids that were, as there was greater emphasis on trying to serve all kids. That's how a lot of these schools came into being. So I thought it'd be interesting. I pulled some stats just to give you a picture of kind of the overall landscape and how it's evolved since from 1970 through 2023. And this was based on some data I found. I found a report in the state archives of the then Department of Education had on enrollment from 1970 through 1982, and then we obviously have more recent data from the 2000s. And you can sort of track sort of overall, the increase in student counts, and then sort of the decline, the decline that we've seen over the last couple of years. And you can see how, the public school enrollment, the enrollment at, the historic academies, which to Senator Williams' point, until the 2000s included BFA up in up north, and then also other independent schools, which include these special education focused therapeutic schools, religious schools. So as I mentioned, the number, in the 1960s was actually quite a bit, higher. As I mentioned, just in a 2-year span, there were, 16 schools that closed, 2,000 students that dropped out of the religious school environments. So there's been a precipitous decline in enrollment there. And by the way, I should highlight, and I did note on the top, this is all in. This is publicly funded as well as private pay students. But one of the things I found really interesting is, overall, this whole time period is that the percentage of students enrolled in the public schools is fairly consistent. There really hasn't been much change over the years. And I think a lot of that sort of reflects, starting in the 1960s and 70s, just the growth of the public school infrastructure. So let's kind of fast forward to like where are we at today? What's the landscape look like? So a couple of things to keep in mind. So independent schools are subject to a variety of and governed by a variety of statutes and what's known as State Board Rule Series 2200, which was recently updated in the last couple of years. Conversely, there's a different Rule Series 2000 that applies to public schools. And I thought it was interesting, because there's a common sort of refrain that I certainly hear that, well, there's independent schools, there's no oversight, there's no regulatory control. And I thought it was fascinating, just a pure page count on the number of regs that apply to independent schools versus the public school rules. It's almost double.
For which?
Pardon me?
Double for which?
So independent school rules, 45 pages long. Public school rules, 23 pages. So there are essentially 3 classes of approved independent schools. And I'm glad Senator Heffernan raised the point that there's this other sort of class of school known as the recognized schools, which are subject to very limited state regulation or oversight. But there's no public money that flows to those schools. So they're not, I've left them out for clarity. So for the approved independent schools, they're with the passage of Act 173 in 2017, I want to say, and then the subsequent update to Rule Series 2200, there are now 2 sort of classes of approved independent schools. There are those that are approved and eligible for public tuition, and those that are approved and ineligible for public tuition. And as I mentioned earlier, there's currently 5 that are ineligible for public tuition. Those that are eligible for public tuition are held to a higher standard. They are required, and it really, much of it revolves around their ability to serve kids with special education needs. So essentially, to keep it really simple, if you're going to accept any publicly funded student, you have to be willing and able to also accept and serve students with special education needs. And if you can't or don't want to do that, you're ineligible for public tuition. So essentially, you have to make a decision which lane you're going to be in. And then there's a third classification, which are therapeutic schools. And these are schools that exclusively serve students who are on what's known as an IEP, which stands for an individualized education plan. So these are kids with, with a formal plan through their local LEA, the supervisory unit or supervisory district. Or they're on a place there as part of a 504, which is an accommodations plan. So those schools that's all they do, and they are the most highly specialized schools out there. By design, they don't take all students. They focus on a particular area. So, for example, we have schools that serve kids with autism, and that's all they do, right? They don't try to do something else because, again, this is a scale issue. If you look at the number of types of students out there and the variety of IEPs and 504 needs, they're not one school can do everything. So they tend to be highly specialized. So those are our therapeutic schools, and they're in their own category. So to be eligible, as I mentioned before, to be eligible for public tuition, you have to meet these new state board rules that govern how you accept and serve kids with special education needs and 504 accommodations. Another sort of unique feature of independent schools is that they undergo periodic review and approval by the State Board of Education. At minimally, under the statute, it's supposed to happen at least once every 5 years. This used to be a process, it used to be a construct that existed for public schools for many years. And the state board, like back in the 1980s, the state board would literally travel around the state, and what was then the Department of Education, they would go into schools, they would inspect them, they'd make a report, and they'd bring their report back to the state board with their findings and a recommendation of whether that public school sort of met the standards or whether they should be approved or not approved, and if they weren't approved, they needed to close. At some point in the late 90s, early 2000s, I can't remember exactly when, that concept went away, and the state board there is no more approval of public schools. They just exist. But that construct continues to exist for independent schools, and that is the sort of the oversight mechanism at a state level. So the Agency of Education, they will review a school's application for renewal to continue to be approved. They'll look at a variety, look at their compliance to the rules and the regs, and look at a variety of factors, and they bring forth a recommendation of the state board. The state board has a committee that hears the initial recommendation from the agency. They bring in the school, they ask questions, they push and pull on various things that they see. And then that committee of the state board then makes a recommendation to the full state board, which meets on a monthly basis, about whether to move forward and either approve that school, to revoke its approval, or to place conditions on its continued approval.
Is that on top of the NASC review?
That's on top. Yes, that's on top. So most independent schools, not all, but most independent schools additionally are accredited by one of two third-party accreditors. So the NEASC, which is the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, used to accredit both colleges and secondary schools, they sort of split into two different organizations, and sort of they're the long-standing sort of historic accreditor in the Northeast. And they accredit both independent schools and some, but not many, public schools. And then there's another accrediting entity, which is the Association of Independent Schools of New England, as the second accreditor. So most, but not all, independent schools, in addition to the state approval, also hold an accreditation.
How does that process work? Yes, process.
So the NEASC process, it's a comprehensive process, and essentially it involves a visiting team of peers from other independent schools from around the Northeast, and they have a whole sort of rubric they go through where they sort of assess where the school's at, and it culminates, there's a lot of gathering of information and documents and things like that. And then there's a visiting team of, 5 or 6 or 7 people. It's a fair number of people from these peer institutions. They actually go into the school, meet with staff, students. They pull records, they confirm things, and they go back and they prepare a formal report that goes to NEASC as the organization with a recommendation of whether they should continue to be accredited. A very similar process for universities and colleges, essentially. So now we get into for those schools that accept public tuition. There's a variety of different mechanisms, and a lot of this, sort of came out of, has developed over many, many years. And as I sort of pointed out, there was sort of an arbitrary number that was set up until the mid 1960s, and they changed the law, recognizing that there were kids who, weren't going into high school because they didn't have that entitlement. And we moved to a construct that we've been under for many years, where there's a concept of what's known as the average announced tuition, which is a rate that's calculated by the Agency of Education based on the announced tuition rates of union school districts. So what the agency does is they have a collection that goes out to public schools around the state, and they ask, hey, what rate of tuition are you going to charge your non-operating districts that are sending you students? And they take the average amongst the union school districts, and that becomes what's known as the average announced tuition. And that is the default rate at which independent schools are paid by non-operating districts. And then there's a couple of variations. So an independent school that also functions as an approved area career technical education center, which is the case with St. Johnsbury Academy and Bennett Institute, they may charge their full tuition. And then, as is the case in many communities in southern Vermont, has been the practice for many years, the electorate may vote to authorize payment of a higher amount. So the practice in several school districts in the southern part of the state is they take what Burton sets as its tuition, and they put it out to the voters as part of the annual budgeting process. And the voters approve that amount, and some districts only pay that amount to Burton, some pay it to Burton plus some other school, or any approved independent school. And then a more recent construct, which only came about in the early 90s, in 1991, is this idea that an independent school meeting EQS, and there's only 2 schools that kind of fall in this category, can also charge their full tuition. And what I don't have on here is public schools. And the way that works for a receiving public school is they set their tuition, what they think it's going to be, and then that's what they charge their sending districts. But then there's a true-up mechanism at the end of the fiscal year. So effectively it's an estimate. And then there's a true-up mechanism at the end of the year. And if the actual cost per student, then what's known as the net cost per student, is plus or minus 5% from what their announced rate is, there is either an additional bill that goes back to the sending district, or a refund that gets credited back to the sending district, depending on whether the number was too high or too low. I point that out because that concept does not exist for independent schools. Independent school tuition is X, that's what they bill. And if it's the wrong number, too bad. You live with it. You got to deal with that. There is no this concept of a true up doesn't exist. What that means in practice, and I'll come to this here in a moment, is that historically, if you look at the tuition rates that are announced by public schools, is there's sort of an inherent sort of built-in incentive to keep the number lower than what you might think it actually is, because nobody likes getting a bill back after you've closed your books. You'd rather get money you weren't expecting than to have to write a check for money you don't have, because then that gets rolled into your next year and it creates a deficit situation. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So just to give you, one thing that, there's, there are people who say, oh, independent schools are growing in Vermont. Well, they're actually not. So independent schools are dealing with the same challenges that public schools are dealing with, right? We have declining enrollment across the state, and the independent school world, is certainly not immune to that. And so you're going to see across, whether they're secular schools, religious schools, therapeutic schools, there's been a net reduction in the number of approved independent schools. So there's been sort of just an organic consolidation, in response to, the market conditions out there.
I'm curious about, and maybe you'll be getting to this, but the ineligibility.
Yes.
I'm curious if you could describe why some of those.
Yeah. So it's a new construct. So it's only been on the books, and I expect that number is going to grow. And so there's one I know of in Senator Heffernan's district, is a great example. So they historically have had like 0 or 1 tuition student, right? So we have a range of independent schools. Some accept and serve large numbers of publicly funded students. Some accept very few or no publicly funded students. So the standards, the expectations under the rules are much greater than if you're going to be eligible for public tuition. You're expected to do more. And if you're an independent school and you're not serving kids, or if you don't have kids on public tuition, and you're not set up to provide those additional services, and you don't want to deal with the additional regulatory requirements, those are the schools that are saying, you know what, that's fine, we don't want to do that. So
the schools that aren't taking publicly tuition kids are saying, all right, we don't want to participate in the system anymore. They're back up.
Exactly. Or some do have some publicly funded students, but it's a small number, and they're just, that's not something that they want to be doing. Yes.
So you basically, from what you've said for the last half hour about what approved independent schools have to do, is why do they remain approved independent schools? I mean, why do they accept public funding if they have to go through all the extra work?
Because we have large areas of the state, which I think is a great tee up to my next slide here.
My kids call me Captain Obvious.
We have, so I bring up the map again. So all the ones that pop in color, these are all the so-called non-operating districts. These are districts that do not operate public schools for some or all grades. And the distinguishing characteristics here are that these are all sparsely, for the most part, you'll see these are sparsely populated areas. So we have, if you look at it in terms of square miles, we've got whatever it is, 9,600 square miles in the state of Vermont. 6,100 square miles are served by school districts that operate public schools for all grades, K through 12, right? So that's 63% of the land mass in Vermont. there's 37% of the landmass in Vermont that is more sparsely populated. And that tends to be where you see these districts that aren't operating public schools for some grades. So I thought it was an interesting exercise. I actually looked at the ADM of all these, for those of you who are new to this, the average daily membership, which is, a proxy, it's an average of, it's a 2-year average of the physical, students coming out of these towns. So you're going to see in those communities that are operating public schools for all grades, they have a much higher ratio of, students to square mile than the non-operating districts. So that's where historically, a lot of these, these academies have evolved in independent schools over time to serve these more rural areas because the infrastructure, the scale wasn't there, the governance structures weren't there to establish public schools, and they sort of have developed, and their mission is to serve the local population, kids in those districts. So you're going to see places like St. Johnsbury Academy, Burton Academy, large numbers of publicly funded students because there are no public schools for those kids to go to. Other questions? I'm going to come back to tuition now. So, as I mentioned before, we have this, this concept of average announced tuition, which is the base tuition of default tuition that independent schools can charge. It's the average of what union school districts announce. But as I mentioned, what's announced is not what the final actual number is. You don't know what the final number is until you close the books. So what's interesting is, you see a pattern, and I've looked at this over the last, several years of what gets announced by public school districts tends to be lower than what the real number is. So what I thought would be interesting to do is I took last year's, so fiscal 24, I took what tuitions were announced by public school districts, and in this example here, I just looked at high schools. What was announced? So those are the blue bars on the chart, and the dashed line represents the average of what was announced. So they said, hey, this is what we're gonna charge non-operating districts that tuition kids in. At the end of fiscal 24, so basically June 30th of last year, books are closed, they go back, and there's a process that's defined by the agency. There's a process where the agency reaches back out, and they get what the actual expenditures are. They look at the actual number of students, they divide that in, and they get what's known as the net cost per pupil. And they produce something known as the allowable tuition report. So I put both the announced and the allowable tuition report should be in your folder. So you can see what those numbers are. And I thought it'd be interesting just is to compare, sort of what was announced, what did the actual number come in at, and then what are the averages. And what's interesting here is, you can see, and I started from left to right, those schools with the highest actual, otherwise known as the net cost per pupil or the allowable tuition rate, what that looks like, and then going from the least expensive over on the right-hand side. And then compared that with what was originally announced or forecast by that school district. And this is important because sometimes people look at the tuition rates that are set by some of the schools some of the independent schools that set their own tuition, and they're like, well, why are they charging more than the average announced tuition? The point I really want to leave with you today is that average number that average announced tuition is effectively an estimate, and it does not reflect what the actual cost is. And the only sort of true comparable is what you're going to find in the allowable report of the net cost per pupil. That's going to be the most comparable. So lo and behold, you look at the average of what the independent schools that set their own tuition, what their tuition rates are versus the statewide average, allowable average is. And it's pretty much at the average. And it's actually slightly below, but. So. That's all I had for my formal slides. I'm happy to just have, sort of open discussion, take questions from you all. But what I want you to take away from this is, hopefully give you, an understanding, because people ask, well, how do we end up with these, these independent schools and these academies that are serving these areas? And, it really is a product of, a governance system that's evolved over time. And it's also a product of the fact that, there are some rural parts of Vermont that have historically and to this day are sparsely populated and just lack the scale to develop that public school infrastructure. So there were these schools that basically stepped in to fill that gap, and they've been doing it for, close to 200 years.
One thing you didn't mention is the construction of the independent schools versus the construction of the.
Yes, so thanks for that. So this is another sort of distinguishing characteristic. So going back to this, some of these changes in the 1960s, there was, the concept of state capital construction aid was provided with matching funds that the state provided school districts to build all these new schools that you all now need to find a way to repair. Those funds were not made available to independent schools. So to this day, independent schools do not receive any state capital construction aid. They are, a big part. I know you'll be hearing from some heads of school. A big part of their job is to go out and find, resources to maintain, update buildings and infrastructure and build new infrastructure. That's a big part of what they do. And it's I think as you look across the state and you look at a lot of these schools, it's a really great example of a private, public partnership and how you can leverage, private funds in a, kind of an entrepreneurial way.
That's got to be figured somewhat in their tuition, that capital to.
Certainly the ongoing maintenance of the buildings, but large capital campaigns, are largely, done as their private endeavors for sure.
Yeah, construction is not built in.
They don't even set aside any money for planning.
Well, they have their own capital budgets and capital campaigns to do that, and they're all privately funded.
So committee, thank you. And can we break now or break after the next presentation? Up to you. Good to go for another one? In that case, we have Sue Siglowski.
Perfect.
Thanks again. Thank you.
From the
Very
Independent
interesting.
School Association, and now we're going to hear
You educate us on the education of independent schools.
from Vermont School Boards Association. So as you recall, we started doing this last week when we started we had in the NEA, and also just sort of doing what your organization does, who you are, just an introduction to your organization, in this case, the Superintendent's Association, School Boards Association, and legislative priorities. So, were you here when we introduced ourselves? You weren't here when we introduced ourselves.
I was not.
Okay, so we'll go through that quickly, starting with
Not Machine, Wyndham County.
Dave Weeks, Rutland County.
Seth Blumberg, Bennington Senate District.
Terry Williams, Rutland County.
Steve Heffernan, Addison County.
Thank you.
And
Sue Siglowski. I am the Executive Director and General Counsel for the Vermont School Boards Association. Thank you very much for the opportunity to introduce the VSBA to all of you. Flora Diaz-Smith, our president, would normally be here with me to do the introduction, but she is not available today due to commitments that she has. She serves on the National School Boards Association Board of Directors, and she has a commitment with them today. If she was here, I know she would speak with you about the critical work of school boards at this moment in time, and also convey that the VSBA and its over 850 elected school board members are deeply grateful for the work that all of you do for the state of Vermont. This is a unique and critical moment for us as a state. The circumstances that we face are complex. They also offer an opportunity to craft innovative, solution-oriented approaches. And we all have a shared responsibility to ensure the well-being of our students, our communities, and future generations. I want you to know that the Vermont School Boards Association takes that responsibility very seriously, and it is reflected in the priorities that I am going to share with you today. I'll cover those after I tell you a bit about who we are, and that is on the front of this paper that I handed out to you. The VSBA is a nonprofit member association that supports school boards in their work. All of the school boards in the state are members, and that encompasses more than 850 individual school board members. VSBA is committed to a strong public education system. We believe public education is a fundamental right. It's the foundation for democracy, the core of strong communities, and a driver of economic development. The VSBA's vision and mission and beliefs are listed on the Who We Are document provided to the committee. The roles and responsibilities of school board members are sometimes misunderstood. School board members, easiest way to think of them is that they are the bridge between the community and the schools. They do not run the schools, they ensure that schools are well run. School board's core responsibilities are listed on this Who We Are document at the very bottom in this rectangle. And they include hiring and evaluating the superintendent, developing a vision for the district, developing and overseeing the budget, adopting policies, and then monitoring all of that and monitoring the finances, the progress, and the performance of the district. Everything school boards do includes the opportunity for community involvement. And again, they are the bridge between the communities and the schools. The VSBA's priorities are listed on the back side of the Who We Are document under legislative platform. And they are developed through resolutions that are proposed by and voted on by the association's members. The priorities are divided into 3 groups. The first group is education funding priorities. Next, we have education cost drivers priorities, and then core priorities. So I'm going to start with the education funding priorities. And I just want to start by saying that VSBA understands the education funding challenges that Vermont is facing, and we want to be a constructive partner in addressing those challenges. We're committed to finding solutions with you. When talking about education funding, the conversation often moves quickly to numbers. And as the people who build school district budgets, we understand that numbers are very important, and also that they can't be considered in isolation. When looking at possible changes to education funding, we have 6 priorities that are listed on the document. And the first is focus on students by providing sufficient funds to support equitable, sustainable, high-quality education in Vermont school systems. Second is ensuring predictability in the school district budget process. Third is giving enough time for school districts to adjust to any changes. Fourth, provide data and modeling to show the impact on districts over time. Fifth, strengthen accountability for the use of public dollars. And 6, include measures to address the cost drivers. And that leads me into the next set of priorities, which are the education cost driver priorities. We believe that addressing the cost drivers behind the increasing cost of education is a critical piece of the complex puzzle that you're going to be trying to solve this legislative session. One of the major drivers in the cost of education is public school employees' health benefits. We urge you to utilize the control that you have by revising the statewide bargaining process for school employees' healthcare. We understand that this will be a difficult discussion, but putting it off will only make the problem worse. The first 2 rounds of statewide bargaining resulted in arbitration decisions that provided increased benefits for public school employees, with most of the increased costs paid for by taxpayers. Through the current bargaining process, benefits have become so rich that school employees pay $0 in deductibles. Benefits should reflect the coverage of most Vermonters. Statewide bargaining is set to begin again in April of 2026. So now is the time for the legislature to make changes to that law in order to impact the next round of bargaining.
Just to interrupt, do you have a proposal along those lines?
Yes,
Okay.
I do. Yes, and I can provide that to you. Another major cost driver is school facilities. Many of Vermont's school buildings have reached the end of their useful life and are being kept in service with Band-Aids that are not cost effective. There's been a moratorium on state aid for school construction since 2008. With an average age of 61 years for Vermont schools, the lack of school construction aid has contributed to a backlog of school construction projects and the decline of school facilities statewide. This has resulted in less safe and less healthy learning environments, as well as impacting school budgets with the cost of the Band-Aid. We ask that you provide predictable and stable state school construction aid for capital expenses. A more recent and very concerning cost driver is the increased need for student mental health supports so that students can access their education. Schools have taken on this expense as the need has grown. We ask you to adequately fund mental health services and programs and ensure that this expense does not fall on the property taxpayers.
So just when you say ensure that we fund mental health programs, are you talking about within the schools, or are you talking about providers outside that provide?
I think it could be either one.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Another cost driver involves the legislature utilizing the education fund to fund statewide programs. This is, of course, the legislature's prerogative, but the effect can be an increase in property taxes that is beyond the control of school boards. Given the critical juncture we are in, we recommend clarifying limitations on the use and purpose of the education fund. And then the last cost driver we'll cover is existing laws and regulations. Many of them were put into place without attention to how much pressure they would put on local school budgets, and without adequate support from the Agency of Education on implementation. So we ask you to adequately fund existing laws and regulations so that school districts are supported in their implementation. In addition to the education funding and education cost driving priorities that I just discussed, VSBA's legislative platform includes some core priorities. I'm not going to be covering the core priorities in detail today, but I did want to highlight 3 of them for you. And those are: first, improve the capacity of the Agency of Education to meet its statutory responsibilities. Second, require the Agency of Education to expand and maintain a comprehensive data dashboard. And third is restructuring the State Board of Education. A VSBA task force of school board members from across Vermont developed these priorities in response to longstanding challenges within the education leadership structure of the state. These challenges have impacted districts' abilities to realize their educational goals. So I submitted the task force report as testimony today, and it's posted on your website. And I can certainly provide you with paper copies if you like. I did not bring paper copies of that with me because it's about 30 pages long.
Is it this?
Yes, it's right there. Yes.
Yeah.
And that report was sent to the governor, the secretary of the Agency of Education, the State Board of Education, and all legislators in September of 2024. The House Education Committee received detailed testimony last week from Claire Wool, who is the Burlington School Board Chair, and she was the chair of this task force, and Flor Diaz-Smith, the SBA president. They testified to House Ed last week about this report, and I know they'd be more than willing to come in and provide testimony to this committee as well if you would like to learn more about the work and the conclusions of the task force.
We'll have contact info given.
I'd be happy to send you
Okay.
contact
Yeah,
info,
okay.
Will. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
I think that provides some important considerations for your, the work that you're going to undertake this session. So in conclusion, I'd really like to thank you for inviting VSBA to testify today and also for your dedication to the important work ahead. We hope that you have a chance to connect with school board members in your region throughout the session, and we look forward to a collaborative partnership with your committee.
Can you, before, you may have a question, but can you talk a little bit more about your second bullet under the core priorities? What does that look like? What does that actually, the comprehensive data dashboard?
Oh, the data dashboard, sure.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yes. There's more information in the task force report about that. And what they point out is that the regular review of consistent valid data is how school boards do their work. And it's important for the agency as well. And for the citizens of Vermont to be able to see how school districts are performing in Vermont. So the data that the task force was taking a look at and asking for and saying that is insufficient right now is accessibility of pre-K through grade 12 student outcome data. It's difficult, if not impossible, to view that longitudinal data about Vermont student outcomes on the website. They were also wanting to see implementation of education policy data. The Secretary of Education is required to supervise and direct the execution of laws relating to public schools and ensure compliance, and yet there's little valid information publicly available as to implementation status of Vermont's education legislation. And some of the examples they gave were Act 77 of 2013 and Act 173 of 2018. Also spending and delivery models. Vermont has a shared financial model for funding, as you all know, and therefore data about both spending and student outcomes should be readily accessible. Measures like per pupil spending, staff to student ratios, capital spending, and much more are not available for easy comparison. And the last piece that they highlighted was clear and transparent data about independent schools. Public and private schools are held to different standards. The same data made available for public schools needs to be made available for independent schools because of our shared funding model. They said we need to be explicit that when we talk about data, we mean the data from all schools that receive Vermont tax dollars.
What data is that again? The outcomes?
Yes.
Obviously, you've seen the governor's outline. What is the sentiment of the school board if it got dropped down to 5 districts?
We have, the board of the VSBA has not met to discuss that yet. They will be meeting. They are waiting for some more details, which will be coming out this week and next week, because there were, it was a concept, but without a lot of detail yet. So, when we get the details, we're going to be digging into that, and I'll be able to come back and answer that question.
Thanks, sir. So, thanks, Sue. You know I respect you, and I respect the efforts of the school boards across the state, in particular in Baldwin County. But I'm finding this kind of generic, and I know we're in the early days of potentially large changes, but just as an example, as a core priority, restructure the State Board of Education. That sentence leads me absolutely nowhere. I'm wondering, with this opportunity, why aren't you kind of needling into what you say that one of the objectives is to establish vision? What's the State Board of Education Association's vision? If it's not, you're about to bump into a pretty significant change, and I'm wondering where your vision is. What is your vision to restructure the State Board of Education?
That is included in the task force report.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we were just trying to create something that was concise, but yes, those details are included in the task force report. And I can provide you with, there was a question earlier about changing the health bargaining law, so I can provide you with this and I can send it so it could be posted on your website as well. But this is a handout about addressing the cost of public school employee health benefits. And so on the back of that page, you can see some recommendations that we have at the bottom.
We heard from Visa about the 5-year review that they go through, and then the NEAS approval. And when you're back under the education funding part, so when you talk about strengthening accountability, are you talking about something like that for the public schools? Is that what you mean by that?
Which piece are you?
When you talk
asking?
about strength and accountability for the use of public dollars, we heard about all the ways that NEAS, that the independent schools are accountable in the way that they are reviewing. Does this bullet review refer to doing something similar for the public schools? Is that what you're talking about?
It's talking about public dollars that are going to private entities and accountability for those dollars.
Okay, not
Yeah.
accountability on the public side on that. Okay,
Yes,
yeah, okay. Thank you.
you're welcome.
I don't know anything else. Anybody else? Okay. Well, why don't we take we have, my computer off. What's next?
We have Beth at
Oh, yeah, 3. Okay. Why don't we take a break until 3?